When her father found out she was pregnant, he didn't ask who the father was. He didn't even ask if she was okay. He just dragged her out of the house by her hair, threw her in the back of a wagon like a sack of unwanted grain, and rode for the mountains. Hours passed. The snow started to fall. The world got quiet. And then he stopped. He pulled her out, her wrists raw from the rope, and shoved her toward a cabin tucked deep in the woods. A man emerged from the shadows, a giant of a man, wrapped in wolf pelts, with a beard as thick as the forest and eyes that held nothing. Not anger, not pity, just nothing. Her father grunted. He tossed a bag of feed on the ground. "She's your problem now." And then he turned his wagon around and rode away without a single look back. June stood there, 17 years old, barefoot in the snow, a baby growing in her belly. And now she belonged to a mountain man who hadn't said a single word. He just stared at her, then pointed a massive hand toward the cabin door, an order, not an invitation. Then he turned his back on her and walked toward a shed, leaving her alone in the biting wind. She was just another chore to be dealt with, another piece of livestock delivered to his doorstep. The cabin door creaked open on its own, pushed by the wind, and a wave of warmth hit her face. A fire danced in the hearth. It was a simple place. A cot in the corner, a rough table, some furs on the wall, and a shotgun mounted over the fireplace. She took a shaky step inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and in that moment, she was utterly, completely alone. Or so she thought. The floorboards groaned behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The giant was back. He filled the doorway, blocking out the light, his silhouette a terrifying promise of the life that was now hers. He stared at her, his face a mask of stone, and she wondered if her father hadn't just abandoned her. She wondered if he had sent her here to die. The man didn't move for a long time. He just watched her, his eyes unblinking. June backed away until her legs hit the edge of the hearth. The heat scorched the back of her thin dress, but she didn't dare move. Her father's slap still stung on her cheek. The memory of his voice still echoed in her ears. "It's your shame. You'll live with it or die with it." Finally, the mountain man moved. He pushed past her without a glance, his shoulder brushing hers, and she flinched like he'd struck her. He walked to the fire, dropped 2 dead rabbits on the floor, and pulled out a long, wicked-looking knife. He started skinning them right there on the floorboards. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wet, tearing sound of his blade. The silence was a weight. It pressed down on her, suffocating her. She had to break it. She had to know. Her voice came out as a cracked whisper. "What's your name?" He didn't look up. His hands kept working, steady and sure. "I said, 'What's your name?'" she repeated, a little louder this time, her fear warring with a desperate need to feel human again. He paused, the knife still in his hand. He wiped a smear of blood on his pants. "Rook," he grunted. Just one word. Flat. Empty. Then he went back to his work. June sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She wouldn't cry. She had cried all morning, cried until her eyes were swollen shut. She wouldn't give this man her tears. She laid down on the hard floor beside the fire that night. He hadn't offered her the cot, and she was too afraid to take it. She curled her hands around her belly, protecting the one secret, the one life that was still hers, and hers alone. The first few days were a silent hell. Rook would be gone before the sun rose and return after it had set, always carrying wood or meat. He never spoke to her. He never looked at her. He ate his food standing by the fire and left her scraps on the table without a word. June started cleaning. She scrubbed the floors. She washed the single pot. She tidied the furs. She did it because she didn't know what else to do. She needed to feel useful. She needed to pretend this was a life, not a prison. He never acknowledged her work. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind. He was something else, something hollowed out, something broken. It was the 5th morning when everything changed. She woke up with a sharp cramp in her belly. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just hunger. But then she looked down. Blood. A dark stain was spreading across the front of her dress, A scream tore from her throat, raw and terrified. "No! Please, no!" The cabin door burst open. Rook stood there, axe in hand, snow on his shoulders. He saw the blood. He saw the terror on her face. And for the first time since she arrived, he moved with purpose, with speed. He dropped the axe, crossed the room in 2 long strides, and before she could protest, he swept her up into his massive arms. He carried her to the cot and laid her down as gently as if she were made of glass. She was shivering, sobbing, whispering over and over again, "Please not the baby, please not the baby." Rook didn't speak. He stoked the fire until it roared. He boiled water. He grabbed every fur in the cabin and piled them on top of her until she was buried in warmth. She saw his hands tremble once, just for a second, as he checked the bleeding. He sat on the floor beside the cot all day and all night, his back against the wall, watching the fire. The bleeding slowed. The cramping stopped. The tiny life inside her, against all odds, held on. In the dead of night, she whispered into the darkness, her voice hoarse. "You cared." He didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the flames. "Don't flatter yourself," he muttered. But his voice cracked when he said it. And June knew. She didn't know what it meant, or why he was here, or what would happen tomorrow. But she knew that the monster her father had sold her to had just saved her child, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Because for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was long dead. Hope. After the scare, something shifted. The silence was still there, a constant presence between them, but it wasn't as heavy. It was different. Rook still didn't talk, but June started to notice things. A second bowl, cleaned and left by the hearth. Not offered, just there. A thick, clean blanket, folded neatly at the foot of the cot she now slept in every night. One morning she found her worn-out boots by the door, the split sole stitched together with thick, careful thread. He never mentioned these things. He never looked at her when she used the bowl or wrapped herself in the blanket. He acted as if they had simply appeared, gifts from the cabin itself. He wasn't being kind. Not in a way the world understood. He was simply providing. Like she was a stray animal he'd taken in, one he refused to name but couldn't bring himself to let starve. Then the storm came. It descended from the mountain peaks like a screaming beast, trapping them inside for 5 days. The wind howled and clawed at the walls. Snow piled up past the windows, burying them in a world of white and gray. The fire became their sun, their moon, their entire universe. Food ran low. The silence returned, this time stretched thin by hunger and confinement. On the 3rd night, June, desperate for water, tried to sneak outside to gather snow. The porch was a sheet of ice. Her feet went out from under her, and she landed hard on her side. A cry of pain ripped from her lips. Rook was there in an instant. He pulled her up, his grip like iron on her arm. "What were you thinking?" he roared, and the sound of his voice, so rarely used, was like a physical blow. "Going out like that?" She winced, clutching her elbow. "I needed water. I told you I'd get it. You were asleep." She saw the fury in his eyes and flinched, turning her head away, expecting a slap. It was a reflex, a movement her father had trained into her bones. Rook froze, his grip loosened. The anger in his face vanished, replaced by something she couldn't read, something dark and pained. "I'm not your father," he said, his voice now a low, rough whisper. She looked up at him, startled. He knelt, his movements suddenly gentle. "You don't flinch like that unless someone's made you expect a blow." He reached for her arm, his big calloused fingers inspecting the scrape. "I won't hit you. Not ever." She stared at him, at this giant of a man who looked like he could break her in two, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "You're the first man who's ever said that to me," she whispered. He didn't reply. He just cleaned her arm, wrapped it carefully, and helped her back inside. That night she cried, Not loud, just silent, shameful tears in the dark. Rook sat by the fire, his back to her, and for the first time, she felt like he wasn't just ignoring her. He was guarding her. Just when a fragile trust began to form, the fever came for her. She woke up drenched in sweat, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would break. The small cabin was spinning, the firelight blurring into streaks of orange and yellow. She tried to call his name, but only a weak croak came out. It didn't matter. Rook's hand was already on her forehead. It felt like ice against her burning skin. He didn't say a word. He didn't waste a second. He just moved. He bolted out the door, straight into the still raging blizzard. June heard the frantic sounds of him saddling his mule, a dark shape against the swirling white, and then he was gone, vanished into the storm. He was gone for 2 days. 2 days where June drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a haze of pain and shivering fear. She was alone. He had left her. The storm, the fever. He had taken his chance and abandoned her to die. Her father had been right. She would die with her shame. Then, on the second night, the door burst open. Rook stumbled in, more dead than alive. His face was raw, wind-burned. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His hands were nearly black with frostbite. He collapsed to his knees, but he didn't let go of what he was carrying. A leather satchel. Inside were herbs, clean cloths, and a small flask filled with a potent, bitter-smelling liquid. He crawled to her side, his movements clumsy from cold and exhaustion. He forced some of the liquid between her lips. She choked it down and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke again, the world was still. The fever had broken. Rook was asleep on the floor, slumped against the wall. He looked gaunt, haunted. He had risked his life. For her. Her voice was a dry rasp. Why? He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion. Why'd you come back? She whispered. You could have just... Let me go. He pushed himself up, his body stiff with pain. He looked at her, then at her belly, then back at her face. He shook his head, a single slow movement. I owed your father a debt, he said, his voice rough. He saved my life once, years ago, pulled me from a frozen river. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't for her. It wasn't for the baby. It was for a debt, a transaction. She was just a piece of her father's property, being paid for in installments of begrudging care. So he gave you a girl in exchange for his life? She asked, the bitterness sharp on her tongue. A pregnant one, no less. Rook looked away, staring into the fire. I didn't know, he said quietly. He just said he had someone who needed a place. Someone difficult. He turned back to her, his dark eyes holding hers. Then I saw you. The bruises, the fear. That wasn't difficult. That was abandoned. He had saved her life, not because he cared about her, but because he was an honorable man paying a debt to a dishonorable one. And June had no idea which was worse. The spring thaw came late, clawing its way down the mountain. The world turned to mud and slush. The cold lingered. Rook was gone longer each day now, hunting, trapping, preparing for something. He still didn't speak much, but the silence had changed. It was filled with unspoken things. He never mentioned her growing belly, but she saw his eyes flicker down to it when she moved too quickly. He started leaving small carved animals on the windowsill. A bird with its wings spread, a tiny, sleeping fox. He never claimed them as his work. They just appeared, like gifts from the forest itself. Then one day, a half-starved dog with a limp followed him home. Rook ignored it, but June couldn't. She named him Tinder and fed him scraps by the fire. That night, Rook wordlessly laid an extra fur pelt near the hearth for the dog to sleep on. A few days later, Tinder wouldn't leave June's side. He'd press his head into her lap, a warm, living weight against her. Guess he's decided who he belongs to, June murmured one evening. Across the room, Rook was sharpening his knife. He didn't look up, but she saw it. A ghost of a smile, there and gone in an instant. It was the first time she had ever seen him almost smile, and it changed everything. That night, he finally broke his own rules. He stood by the window, staring out into the dark. "How far along are you?" he asked, his back still to her. She froze. He never asked questions, not personal ones. 6 months, maybe 7. He nodded. A long silence stretched between them. "Is the father gone?" he asked, his voice low. June's throat tightened. He wasn't a father. He was the preacher's son. The words spilled out of her then, a torrent of poison she had held in for too long. "He promised he'd marry me. He said he loved me. We met in secret. I thought it meant something." She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "When I told him about the baby, he told his father I'd seduced him, that I was a sinner trying to trap a good Christian man." She looked up at Rook's broad back. "My father believed them. He didn't even ask me. He just got rid of me." Rook finally turned around. His face was a storm of emotions she couldn't decipher. His jaw was clenched, but his hands were loose at his sides. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was quiet. Not full of pity, full of something else, something like anger. "For what?" she choked out. "For how they treated you," he said. "For all of it." She stared at him, this silent, broken man who had taken her in as payment for a debt. This man who had saved her life, stitched her boots, and now stood before her like a shield. The dam inside her broke. The story she'd buried spilled out, about the preacher's son, the lies, the betrayal. He just stood there and listened, his presence a solid, unmovable rock in the swirling chaos of her past. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened. And when she was done, when the last of the poison had been drawn out, he said something that shook her to her very core. "Your father didn't just tell me you were difficult," Rook said, his voice a low rumble. "He told me you were wicked. He said you drove your own mother to an early grave with your sin." June stared at him, her blood running cold. "My mother, she died of a fever 2 years ago." "I know," Rook said, his eyes burning with a dark fire. "And a man who would lie about his own wife to condemn his daughter. He's the one who is wicked. Her father hadn't just abandoned her. He had tried to erase her. He had painted her as a monster to justify his own cruelty. And this man, this stranger, was the first person to see the truth. The baby came in the dead of night, weeks early. One moment June was sleeping, the next she was awake, ripped from a dream by a pain so sharp it stole her breath. The water broke, and a scream she couldn't contain tore through the cabin. Rook was at her side in a heartbeat. He didn't panic. He didn't ask questions. He moved with a calm, terrifying efficiency. He boiled water. He laid out clean cloths. He built the fire so high the little cabin glowed like a furnace. The pain was a storm, a hurricane inside her bones. It ripped her apart and put her back together again, over and over. She screamed until her throat was raw. She grabbed Rook's hand and squeezed, sure she was crushing his fingers, but he didn't pull away. He held on tight, his voice a low, steady rumble in her ear. "Breathe. You're strong. Almost there. He's almost here." She managed a hysterical, tear-soaked laugh. "How do you know it's a he?" "Just a feeling," he grunted, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a cool cloth. But he was wrong. When the baby finally came, red and screaming and furiously alive, it wasn't a boy. It was a girl. Tiny, perfect, with a full head of dark hair and fists that were curled tight, like she was ready to take on the world that had tried to deny her. June sobbed, not from pain anymore, but from a wave of love so powerful it felt like it could drown her. Rook cut the cord with steady hands. He cleaned the baby, wrapped her in the softest fur, and handed her to June as if he were presenting a queen with her crown. His face was still a stoic mask, but his eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "What will you name her?" he asked, his voice thick. June looked down at the tiny, fierce face of her daughter. A daughter she was never supposed to have, a daughter who had survived everything. "Hope," she whispered. Her name is Hope. Rook nodded, a slow, solemn movement. It fits. He looked at June, at the baby in her arms, and then around the small, warm cabin. You'd have survived without me, he said quietly. No, June said, her voice clear and strong. I would have survived, but I wouldn't have lived. He didn't answer, but that night he moved the cot closer to the fire. He pulled up the only other chair in the cabin and sat beside them, watching over his two survivors as the wind howled outside. For the first time, the little cabin felt less like a prison and more like a fortress, and they were all safe inside. But the world outside wasn't done with them yet. 3 days later, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, measured, 2 sharp raps. Rook and June froze. No one ever came this far up the mountain. No one. Rook stood, his body instantly tense. He moved to the door, grabbing the shotgun from the mantel as he went. He opened it a crack. A boy stood on the porch. He couldn't have been more than 15, thin as a rail, with mud caked on his boots and fear in his wide eyes. He was clutching a worn hat in his hands. You Rook? The boy stammered. Who's asking? Rook's voice was a low growl. The boy licked his chapped lips. I'm looking for a girl. Her name is June. His eyes darted past Rook and found her, standing by the fire with Hope in her arms. His face lit up with disbelief. June? June stepped forward, her heart pounding. Who are you? It's me, he said, his voice cracking. Seth, your brother. The world tilted on its axis. Seth, her younger brother, here, she stumbled out onto the porch, barefoot in the snow, clutching Hope so tightly the baby let out a small whimper. Seth, I don't understand. He took a step forward, his eyes wild. Father told everyone you were dead. He told the whole town you ran off and shamed the family, and that you probably threw yourself in the river. Dead. Her father had declared her dead. But Ma, she got sick, Seth rushed on, the words tumbling out. Real sick. And before, she told me the truth. She told me where he took you. She made me promise to find you. Rook's hand tightened on the shotgun. Why come now? Seth swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between the giant of a man and his sister who was supposed to be a ghost. Because Pa's gone, he said, and the words dropped like stones into the sudden silence. He ran. The sheriff started asking questions about you, about the preacher's son, about hush money. The town wasn't mourning a shamed girl. It was uncovering a conspiracy. Ma said to find you, Seth finished, his voice trembling. She said bring you home. Home. The word was a foreign country. June looked from her brother's desperate face to the warm, sleeping bundle in her arms. She looked back at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the silent, dangerous man who stood guard on the porch. She looked at Seth and whispered a truth that stunned them all. I already am. Seth stayed. He slept by the fire, curled up in a spare blanket, too timid to ask for more, but too exhausted to care. June lay awake all night, Hope breathing softly against her chest, her mind a whirlwind. Home. Her brother wanted her to come home. But the house she grew up in was never a home. It was a place of cold words and hot anger, and the town was a place of whispers and pointed fingers. They had all believed her father. They had all condemned her without a trial. And what about Rook? The man who had grunted at her like she was an animal was now the man who sat up all night to watch her baby breathe. The man who'd taken her as payment for a debt, had risked his life for her in a blizzard. He didn't talk about feelings. He didn't use soft words. But he had built her a fortress of quiet, steady care. She had found it the day before Seth arrived, tucked behind the woodshed, a half-finished cradle, carved from pine wood, the rockers sanded smooth. He had been building a place for her baby, for their baby. She didn't want to lose that. She didn't want to lose him. The next morning, Seth's story spilled out in more detail. Mama's sick, he said, staring into his bowl of oats. The doctor says her lungs are failing, says she won't make it to summer. June's heart clenched. Why didn't she stop him? She whispered, the old anger a bitter taste in her mouth. When he dragged me out of that house? She tried, Seth said, his voice small. I heard them fighting. He told her if she said a word, he'd do the same to her. And Mama, she ain't strong like you, June. I wasn't strong, June said, her voice hard. I was lucky. No, Seth insisted, looking up at her with his earnest, frightened eyes. You got out. Rook stepped inside then, his arms full of firewood. He hadn't said a word about Seth's arrival, but he'd been listening. He always listened. He knelt by the fire, his back to them, his movements slow and deliberate. I don't know what to do, June admitted to the silent cabin. Rook spoke without turning around. You don't have to decide now. But she did. She had to. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the tiny girl sleeping in the cradle Rook had built. It was about the brother who had walked through snow and ice because he believed she was alive. It was about the mother who was dying with regret in her heart. She was a mother now. And mothers don't run from the things that need facing. That night, she packed a small bag. Rook gave her his heaviest wolf pelt coat. It swallowed her whole, but its weight was comforting. He helped her saddle one of his mules, his hands moving silently beside hers in the dark. I won't be long, she said quietly, just long enough. He just nodded. But as she mounted the mule, with Seth climbing up behind her, Rook put his hand on the bridle, stopping her. He looked up at her, his face shadowed in the moonlight. You come back, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact, a promise he was making to the universe on her behalf. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise of her own. I will. And with that, she turned her back on the only home she had ever really known, and rode toward the ghosts she had to face. The town hadn't changed, but the people had. As June rode down the main street, holding hope tight against her chest, people stopped and stared. Not with scorn anymore. Not with pity. They looked at her with a kind of fearful awe. The girl they had all written off as dead had returned, and she hadn't come back broken. She had come back with a child in her arms and a fire in her eyes. Her mother was even worse than Seth had described. She was a fragile, bird-like creature, lost in a sea of blankets, her breath a shallow rattle. When June walked into the room, her mother tried to sit up, her eyes wide with a desperate, hungry light. June, she rasped, my baby. June sat on the edge of the bed and gently placed Hope in her mother's frail arms. The old woman stared down at her granddaughter, tears tracing paths through the wrinkles on her face. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I should have. I was a coward. Yes, June said, her own tears falling freely now. You were. There was no grand speech of forgiveness. There didn't need to be. The truth was enough. A lifetime of unspoken pain and regret passed between them in that single shared look. June stayed for 3 days. She held her mother's hand as she slipped away from the world. She listened as Seth, braver than he had ever been, told the sheriff the entire story of the preacher's son and the hush money. And she stood in the empty, silent house of her father and felt nothing but a cold, hard emptiness where her fear used to be. The preacher's son was arrested. The town was buzzing with the scandal. Her father, they said, had vanished completely, a coward to the very end. When June left town, she wasn't running away. She was walking toward her future. Seth walked beside her, his head held high. What now? He asked as they started the long journey back up the mountain. June looked toward the distant peaks, a silhouette against the cold blue sky. We go home, she said. The journey back was harder, the trail steeper, but June didn't feel it. She felt lighter than she had in her entire life. When the cabin finally came into view, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a knot in her chest loosened. Rook was on the porch. waiting. He didn't move as she dismounted, his eyes taking in everything. Her, Seth, the quiet strength in her posture. "You came back," he said. It wasn't a question. She smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I told you I would." Then, before she could second-guess herself, she walked right up to him and placed Hope in his arms. The giant of a man, the silent monster, looked down at the tiny baby nestled against his chest. Hope stirred, blinked her big, dark eyes up at him, and reached out a tiny hand to touch his rough beard. "She's gotten heavier," Rook murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he would never name. "She eats like her mother," June said, and for the first time, she laughed. A real, free laugh that echoed in the clean mountain air. And together, the three of them, the broken man, the abandoned girl, and the baby named Hope, walked back into the cabin. But they weren't the same people who had been there before. They were a family. And their story was just beginning. Peace was a fragile thing. They had built a life in the silence of the mountains. A quiet rhythm of chopping wood, mending clothes, and rocking a baby to sleep. Seth grew stronger, his shoulders broadening as he learned the ways of the woods from Rook. He was quiet like Rook, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, protective loyalty. Hope was their center, a tiny, toddling force of nature with Rook's stubborn frown and June's defiant eyes. Rook, the man of stone, would spend hours carving her little wooden animals. He'd leave them on the mantel, a silent offering to the little girl who had cracked his heart wide open. But the world below hadn't forgotten them. The thaw had brought warmth, but it had also brought whispers, and whispers travel fast. One afternoon, a man rode up the trail. He wasn't a local. He wore a long coat and had a badge pinned to his chest, a U.S. Marshal. His name was Bram, and he had come with a warning. "The preacher's father is stirring up trouble," Bram said, his eyes hard. "He's telling folks his boy was framed, that you're a liar and a seductress. He's got friends, dangerous ones. They blame you for the shame brought on their town." "They blamed me once before," June said, her voice cold. Hope was on her hip, a warm, solid weight. "This time," Bram said, his gaze lingering on Rook, who stood by the door like a silent sentinel, "I think they mean to do more than blame." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving a new kind of chill in the air. That night, the easy silence of the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting quiet. "Do you think they'll come?" June asked, her voice a whisper in the dark. Rook didn't lie. He never lied. Maybe. He looked at her, at the family he had somehow found himself protecting, and the weight in his eyes was heavier than any mountain. "If they do," he said, his voice a low, final promise, "they won't get through me." 2 nights later they came. Seth saw them first, 3 shadows detaching themselves from the tree line at dusk, moving with a sinister quiet. Rook didn't hesitate. "June, get the baby. Seth inside. Bar the door." But Seth, the boy who used to flinch at raised voices, stood his ground. He held a heavy log meant for the fire, like it was a battle axe. "I'm not hiding," he said, his voice shaking but firm. Rook looked at the boy, and a flicker of something that looked like pride crossed his face. He knelt down. "Brave men know when to protect the ones who can't fight," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Your sister needs you. That baby needs you." Seth's jaw tightened. He gave a sharp nod and disappeared inside, the heavy bar falling into place across the door. The first shot shattered the evening quiet, splintering the wood of the porch rail. Rook returned fire, a single booming shot from his rifle. A cry of pain echoed from the trees. They hadn't expected a fight. They had expected a frightened girl and a lone trapper. They hadn't expected a fortress. A voice called out from the darkness. It was the preacher. "We only came to talk," he shouted, his voice thick with false piety. "You brought guns to talk," Rook roared back. "You brought a whore to our mountain." The preacher shrieked, his mask of civility slipping. "That child she carries is an abomination." But before Rook could answer, Another voice, high and clear, rang out from the woods behind the preacher. "Leave them be!" It was Seth. The boy had slipped out the back window. He was perched in a tree, a small, defiant figure against the darkening sky. "She's my sister! That baby is my family! You want them? You come through me!" The preacher and his men faltered, confused. And in that moment of hesitation, another figure emerged from the trees, rifle raised. It was the marshal, Bram. "This ends now," Bram's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. "Or it ends at the end of a rope." The preacher's men dropped their guns. The fight was over before it had truly begun, but the war was far from won. Because the next day, a different lawman came up the mountain, a local sheriff named Lyle, and he wasn't carrying a warning. He was carrying a book. "We found it in the preacher's house," Sheriff Lyle said, his face grim. "A ledger." He opened the leather-bound book on the table. It was filled with names, girls' names, and next to them, dates, locations, and sums of money. The preacher and his friends, they weren't just covering up for his son, Lyle said, his voice low. They were in business. They found families with difficult daughters, girls who were too wild, too defiant, or pregnant. They'd convinced the fathers it was God's will to send them away, to be reformed. June felt the blood drain from her face. They weren't sending them to be reformed, were they? Rook asked, his voice deadly calm. The sheriff shook his head. They were selling them, to work camps, to lonely men in other counties, to whoever would pay. Your father, he said, looking at June with pity in his eyes, was one of his best suppliers. It wasn't just about her. It was never just about her. She was just one of many. A long line of forgotten daughters, sold like cattle by the men who were supposed to protect them. And then the sheriff turned the page, and June saw it. Her own name, written in her father's familiar scrawl, and next to it, a second name. Seth. The sheriff's voice was gentle. The plan wasn't just to get rid of you, June. Once you were gone and declared dead, your brother was next. The preacher had already found a buyer for him. A mine in the West. Her father hadn't just tried to erase her. He was going to sell his son, too. The world went silent. The crackling fire, the wind outside, her own heartbeat. It all faded away. There was only the spidery scrawl in the ledger, her name, her brother's name, a list of assets to be liquidated. Rook's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The rage coming off him was a palpable heat in the cold cabin. "We need your testimony, June," the sheriff said softly. "There are other girls, other families, your father, the preacher. They've been doing this for years. You're the only one who got out. You're the only one who can speak for the ones who didn't. Go back. Go back to that town, to those people, and face them all." The thought was a physical sickness. She had found her peace here. She had clawed it out of the dirt and snow with her bare hands. They had no right to ask her to leave it. She looked at Seth. He was staring at the ledger, his face pale, his eyes filled with a terrifying understanding of how close he had come to disappearing forever. She looked at Hope, sleeping in her cradle, oblivious to the evil that had almost snuffed her out before she'd even drawn her first breath. And she looked at Rook. He was watching her, his dark eyes seeing straight through to the frightened girl still hiding inside her. "You don't have to," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You don't owe them anything." "I know," she whispered. But she was wrong. She owed it to the girl who was dragged up a mountain. She owed it to the brother who was next on the list. And she owed it to the baby who deserved to grow up in a world where monsters like her father didn't get to win. She turned to the sheriff, her back straight, her voice clear and cold as a mountain stream. "Tell me when the trial is," she said. "I'll be there." Rook's hand squeezed her shoulder, just once. It was all she needed. The girl who had been thrown away was about to go back and burn their whole rotten world to the ground. The trial was a storm of its own. June walked into the small courthouse with Rook at her side, a silent mountain of a man who made the townsfolk shrink back in fear. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a declaration. This woman is mine to protect. Harm her at your peril. June stood before them all, her father shackled and sneering, the preacher's allies pale and sweating, the whole town packed into the pews, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dawning horror. She told them everything. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke of the preacher's son and his lies. She spoke of her father's cold eyes as he traded her for his own peace of mind. She spoke of being left for dead, of the fear, the cold, the hunger. And then she spoke of Rook, of the silent kindness, the mended boots, the fever in the blizzard. She spoke of the birth of her daughter Hope. She told them how she hadn't just survived. She had found a life, a better one. When she was done, there was a dead silence in the courtroom. Then, one by one, other people started to stand up. An old farmer whose daughter had been sent away for being too willful. A widow whose niece had gone to work for the church and was never heard from again. The stories came out, a flood of hidden pain and suppressed grief, all pointing back to the preacher and his ledger of souls. The town had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies, and June had just torn it all down. Her father was sentenced to life in prison. The preacher's men were arrested. A warrant was issued for the preacher himself, who was never seen again. He had vanished into the shadows he once commanded. June walked out of that courthouse into the clean air, feeling lighter than she ever had before. She hadn't just found justice for herself. She had given a voice to the ghosts. When they returned to the mountain, spring had fully arrived. The world was bursting with green, with life, with possibility. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rook came to her. He didn't have much, but he held out his hand. In his palm was a small, simple ring, carved from the dark, rich wood of a walnut tree. "I never thought I'd ask anyone anything ever again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I find I can't imagine a day without you in it." June smiled, tears she hadn't shed in the courtroom now tracking paths down her cheeks. She held out her hand. "You didn't have to ask." He slipped the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. The seasons turned, the years passed. Hope grew into a fierce, bright girl with her mother's courage and Rook's quiet strength. Seth became a man, leaving the mountain to build a life of his own. But he always returned, bringing books and news from the world below. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a home, filled with laughter, the smell of baking bread, and the sprawling love of a family forged in fire. Rook's beard turned to silver. His steps grew slower, but his hands were just as gentle when he held his wife's. He died peacefully one winter morning, in the bed they shared, with June's hand in his. They buried him under a tall spruce tree overlooking the valley, the mountain he had loved taking him back into its embrace. June lived on, the matriarch of the mountain. Her story became a legend in the town below, the girl who was sold like cattle but returned a queen, the woman who faced down monsters and built a kingdom of her own. Sometimes, on clear nights, she would sit on the porch of the cabin, her hair as white as the snow on the peaks, and look out at the endless sea of stars. She would feel the steady hum of the mountain beneath her feet, and she would feel him there beside her, not a ghost, but a presence, a promise kept. The world had tried to bury her. It had thrown her away in the dark and the cold. It just didn't know that she was a seed. And from the worst of all beginnings, she had grown into something magnificent. If you were moved by June's incredible story of resilience and love, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story we have in store for you.